Sometimes the ones who understand the most suffer the deepest, not because they're broken, but because they see through every smile, every silence, every lie, until the world becomes too transparent to hold. This is Inner Moonlight, where we don't chase answers, we sit with the ache. So before you dissolve into this quiet with me, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely resonate with what I do here. Now let's begin. What if knowing too much is the very reason peace feels so far away? In an age where information is abundant but meaning is scarce, the intellect has become a double-edged sword. Many of those who carry a sharp mind, a keen sense of perception, and a deep inner sensitivity are also those who suffer in ways that feel unnameable. Not because they lack the answers, but because they see through too many of them. There's a peculiar kind of sorrow that lives in those who understand the world too well. The kind of sorrow that doesn't scream but sits quietly behind the eyes. For these individuals, the beauty of life is often overshadowed by the complexity of it. The joy of a moment is questioned before it can be felt. The silence of a room is filled with mental noise, and even love becomes something to analyze, not surrender to. In Buddhist terms, this is not a personal failure. It is simply one form of dukkha, existential dissatisfaction, manifesting in a particular flavor. Intelligence, in and of itself, is not the issue. What entangles the mind is the illusion that clarity alone will save us, that seeing through the illusions of others will somehow resolve the illusions within. But as many find, the clearer the world becomes, the more unbearable it sometimes feels. There's a trap hidden in awareness. When the mind is trained to detect patterns, to spot inconsistencies, to untangle emotional knots, it starts doing it all the time, even in moments meant for stillness. A walk in nature turns into an inner debate about climate change. A compliment triggers an analysis of hidden motives. A moment of peace becomes a puzzle to be solved. The overactive mind does not rest, it circles. And so, paradoxically, the very tool that was sharpened in the pursuit of truth becomes the sword that cuts peace to pieces. In Buddhist thought, this is where wisdom must be paired with compassion, not just for others, but for the self. When the intellect is overdeveloped and the heart undernourished, life becomes a set of observations, not a lived experience. One can name every emotional state and still not feel safe enough to cry. One can understand every theory of suffering and still ache silently at night. The mind says, I've seen this before, I know what this is. But the Dharma says, have we felt it? Have we sat with it, not just studied it? Because insight without presence is empty. It is a lamp without oil. And for many bright, high-functioning individuals, the spiritual path becomes another achievement to pursue, another puzzle to master. But enlightenment is not a reward for the clever. It is a homecoming for the surrendered. This is why the Buddha never praised intellect alone. He praised sincerity, humility, the willingness to put down the questions and meet life as it is, vulnerable, mysterious, alive. There is a story in the Pali Canon about a learned scholar who visited the Buddha, full of questions. He spoke at length about philosophy, causality, and the nature of mind. The Buddha listened patiently, then poured a cup of water until it overflowed. The scholar interrupted, "It's spilling." The Buddha looked at him and said, "Like this cup, you are full of your own ideas. Until you empty it, nothing more can enter. The mind that is full cannot receive. The intellect that never bows cannot awaken." So for those of us who feel lost, in spite of knowing so much, perhaps the invitation is not to learn more, but to lay something down. Perhaps the path forward isn't more answers, but fewer conclusions. Perhaps peace is not something found through understanding, but through being. The Dharma does not promise to explain the world. It simply invites us to stop resisting it. Somewhere along the way, many of us learned that caring was synonymous with love, with loyalty, with being a good person. And so we cared, fiercely, sometimes to the point of unraveling. We cared about people who couldn't care for us. We cared about outcomes we couldn't control. We cared about what others thought, so much so that their opinions became our self-worth. But what begins as tenderness can harden into torment. What starts as love becomes anxiety, attachment, the belief that unless we fix, please, or save, we are unworthy of peace. And yet, the deeper truth is more subtle. and more liberating. Buddhism speaks often of attachment, not to shame it, but to name it, to reveal how even noble intentions can entangle us. Tanha, craving, comes in many forms. The craving to be understood, to be liked, to be chosen. Even the craving to always be seen as good. The world tells us to care more, to give endlessly, to self-sacrifice until our spine bends from the weight of other people's expectations. But the Dharma whispers a different instruction. Care, yes, but without clinging, without losing ourselves in the storm of other people's storms. There is a suffering that arises not from abandonment, but from the refusal to abandon what no longer serves. Some of us carry relationships long past their expiration date. We remain available to people who are emotionally bankrupt. We offer explanations to those who don't listen, affection to those who only take, truth to those who weaponize it. And the question arises, who taught us that this was noble? For many it was childhood. Households where love was conditional, where silence meant safety, where being needed felt like being wanted. We learned early to anticipate moods, to decode tension, to regulate others so we wouldn't be hurt. And so now as adults, we repeat the ritual. We orbit people's chaos like moons around unstable planets, believing that if we just love harder, they will become whole. But they don't. And neither do we. Because caring, when rooted in fear, becomes control in disguise. We think we're being kind, but really we're trying to keep the pain predictable. We try to manage the narrative, to soften rejection before it arrives, to earn love before it can be taken away. Buddhism doesn't ask us to stop loving. It asks us to love wisely, with discernment, with boundaries that honor both self and other. Because without boundaries, care becomes codependency, and compassion turns into martyrdom. There's a moment in every seeker's life when they realize not every battle deserves attendance, not every insult requires a rebuttal, not every connection is meant to last, and not every pain needs to be carried just because we have the capacity to carry it. Letting go is not cruelty, it is clarity. Some people will call it indifference. They will say, "You've changed," and they'll be right. Because the moment we stop over-functioning in relationships, the dynamics shift. Those who relied on our guilt to keep us close will protest. Those who benefited from our self-neglect will accuse us of selfishness. But that's okay. The path of liberation is not paved with approval. There is a deeper caring, one that includes the self. A care that says, "I will not abandon my peace for someone else's chaos." A care that no longer asks, "Do they like me?" but instead wonders, "Am I living in truth?" We begin to realize that the highest form of care is presence. And that presence includes knowing when to walk away, when to stop pouring into cups with holes, when to stop auditioning for love we've already earned by simply existing. This is not coldness. It is warmth redirected inward. The lotus does not bloom because it forces the mud to change. It rises anyway, unattached, unapologetic, unhurried. And perhaps we can too. In the stillness that follows surrender, something sacred begins to take root. A peace not dependent on others. A freedom that comes not from indifference, but from no longer needing to prove our value through suffering. When caring becomes a cage, the key is in letting go, not of love itself, but of the illusion that love requires self-abandonment. And from that release, something surprising begins to happen. Things fall into place, not because we force them to, but because we finally stop getting in their way. There comes a moment, often after exhaustion has replaced hope, when the soul simply stops trying. Not out of bitterness, but clarity. Not out of defeat, but wisdom. It's the moment when we stop chasing closure and begin embracing silence. When the need to be understood dissolves and the hunger to be right simply fades. When we no longer look for signs, no longer scroll for answers, no longer craft invisible arguments in the shower or lie awake replaying conversations in our heads. Some call it giving up. The Dharma calls it letting go. In Buddhism, peace is not a reward. It is what remains when clinging ends. And clinging can take many shapes: the desire for validation, the craving for resolution, the attachment to being seen as good, loyal, kind, loving, or essential in someone's life. But when we look closely, what we call care is often negotiation, a quiet hope that if we love in just the right way, others will become who we need them to be. If we are soft enough, patient enough, pleasing enough, they will stay. If we endure enough, they will change. And so we stay in the performance. Yet there is a strange freedom in the moment we no longer care to be chosen. When we stop proving our worth, stop curating our personality to fit another's mold, stop editing our truth to keep someone comfortable. It is not cruelty, it is alignment, a returning home to ourselves. Peace, then, does not announce itself with trumpets. It creeps in like dawn, quiet and almost invisible, until we realize we have gone an entire day without spiraling, an hour without rehearsing old pain, a moment without questioning whether we are enough. The mind, once noisy with narratives, begins to quiet. The heart, once swollen with trying, begins to soften. And in that stillness, we begin to see clearly, not just others, but ourselves. There's a parable in the Zen tradition of a man in a boat. He's rowing across a foggy lake when suddenly another boat crashes into his. Enraged, he begins yelling at the person who must have been so careless, only to realize the other boat is empty. The anger disappears, not because the damage didn't happen, but because he saw there was no one to blame. So many of us carry resentment like that man, angry at empty boats, wounded by people who were never capable, expecting apologies from those who don't even see the harm, waiting for closure from those who have long moved on. But what if we let the boat be empty? What if we no longer needed to assign fault, justify our leaving, or defend our silence? What if we simply honored our peace as sacred, without needing it to be validated by those who cannot offer it? Because here's the truth, some will never understand what they did. Some are not deep enough to see the depths they stirred in us. And that's okay. We do not heal by dragging others into our awakening. We heal when we stop dragging ourselves back into their ignorance. There is a flavor of peace that cannot be tasted while caring too much about being liked. A serenity that arrives only when we stop trying to make everyone comfortable, especially those who benefit from our discomfort. And perhaps this is the turning point, when the goal is no longer to be chosen, but to be free. Free from roles we never agreed to play, free from dynamics that drain us, free from the lie that our love must hurt to be real. Some may see this as cold, but it's not ice, it's fire turned inward, a fire that purifies, not destroys. A fire that says I no longer need to burn myself to keep others warm. The Dharma teaches not only how to open the heart, but how to protect it. And sometimes protection looks like distance, like silence, like deciding not to pick up what was never ours to carry. It is then, and only then, that life begins to organize itself around a different axis, not around pleasing, not around surviving, but around truth, around rest, around the kind of quiet that finally feels like coming home. Not all revolutions are loud. Some begin in silence, like the quiet decision to no longer respond to what drains us, to no longer explain our absence, to no longer justify our peace. Detachment in its true form is not apathy. It's not a wall. It's not a cold shoulder turned against the world. It is a deep and sacred refusal to suffer needlessly, a conscious act of mercy directed inward. In the Buddhist tradition, upekkha, equanimity, is considered one of the highest forms of love. It is love without grasping, compassion without condition, a love that sees clearly but does not cling, that gives freely but does not bleed itself dry, that walks away when the soul begins to shrink in someone else's shadow. It is this kind of detachment that allows us to breathe again. Because how many years have we spent entangled in battles that were never truly ours, carrying burdens of other people's confusion, twisting ourselves into versions that felt acceptable, apologizing for boundaries, shrinking around egos, smiling through silences that broke us. And then one day, something shifts, not because we read another self-help book, not because we heard the perfect quote, but because we're tired. Tired of the cycles, tired of being hurt by the same dynamic in a different costume, tired of offering tenderness into a void. And so we do something radical. We stop trying, not from hopelessness, but from clarity. This kind of detachment is not a rejection of love. It is the beginning of a truer, quieter form of it. One that does not demand to be seen. One that does not negotiate its value. One that arises from within and asks for nothing in return. When we stop trying to prove our worth to people who never learned how to see it, we begin to remember that it was never theirs to validate. And when we stop investing energy into being understood by those committed to misunderstanding us, we begin to reclaim that energy for something better, our own healing. It is in detachment that the self begins to blossom again. The mind becomes clearer, the body feels lighter, the nights grow quieter, the days less like battles and more like invitations. Invitations to be here, to be real, to be present with what is, instead of always contorting for what should be. And slowly, people who feel like home begin to appear, not because we went looking for them, but because we finally stopped dimming ourselves for those who didn't want to stay. That's the paradox. Letting go makes space. Letting go of the idea that our value is tied to how needed we are. Letting go of the narrative that loyalty means self-betrayal. Letting go of the idea that healing must happen in someone else's presence. Real growth often looks like distance, like detaching not just from people but from the version of ourselves that tolerated too much, that apologized for being tired, that called chaos intimacy. And in that quiet rebellion, something incredible begins to take shape. Life starts rearranging around the new vibration. Peace becomes the new standard. Drama feels foreign. Our nervous system recalibrates to calm, and we stop craving what used to break us. Buddhism never taught detachment as denial. It taught it as discernment, a sacred pause, a refusal to pour ourselves into cups with holes in the bottom, because we begin to see not everything is meant to be fixed. Some things are meant to be left. Some people are not meant to be understood. They are meant to be released. And what we thought was abandonment was actually alignment. In the space left behind, we hear it clearly at last, the voice of our own soul, whispering, "Thank you for finally listening." There's a moment, soft, almost imperceptible, when the noise fades, not because the world has grown kinder, not because the problems have disappeared, but because something inside no longer reacts the same way, no longer flinches at the familiar, no longer grabs at the fire just to prove it still burns. That moment is peace. But not the peace most of us were taught to wait for, the kind that arrives after the storm as a reward for endurance. No, this is a different peace, the kind that arrives in the middle of chaos, the kind we choose again and again by not participating in the drama that once pulled us under. Letting go isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like not texting back, like staying home instead of overextending, like no longer explaining your worth to someone who has never made room for it, like walking away not out of anger, but out of reverence for your own spirit. Because what we protect begins to flourish, and when we protect our attention, our time, our energy, we begin to notice what truly matters. A walk at sunset, a cup of tea held with both hands, the way the wind touches our face when we finally slow down. These are not small things. These are the sacred moments we miss when we are too busy caring about what doesn't care for us. Buddhist teachings remind us attachment is the root of suffering. But non-attachment does not mean indifference. It means presence. It means we care deeply, but without clinging. We give fully, but without expectation. We feel everything, but without letting it own us. And in that subtle shift, from clinging to caring, from reacting to responding, we begin to live differently. There is no longer a need to chase, no longer a need to defend, no longer a need to be understood by everyone, liked by everyone, approved of by everyone. That version of the self was exhausted, and it deserves to rest now. This is what freedom feels like. Not a life without pain, but a life where pain no longer becomes identity. Not a life without relationships, but a life where relationships are chosen, not clung to. Not a life of isolation, but one of inner clarity, where solitude becomes a sanctuary, not a sentence. And this clarity is not cold, it is luminous. Because when we stop caring about the wrong things, we begin to love the right ones more fiercely. We begin to notice those who stayed quietly beside us all along. We become more tender, not less, more generous, not more guarded. But now, it comes from fullness, not from the desperate need to be needed. The world will still spin, people will still misunderstand, life will still bruise the heart from time to time, but it no longer has the same grip. Because now, something steady lives inside. Something soft but unshakable. Something like grace. And so the lesson whispers, not everything requires a reaction. Not every fire is ours to put out. Not every weight is ours to carry. The moment we stop chasing validation, we remember who we are. The moment we stop caring for those who never cared to see us, we begin to see ourselves. Let it be known, when we stop clinging, everything falls, not apart, but into place.